Right now, we are observing activity in Pokrovsk and around it, and of course, as you know, the enemy plans to continue using these small infantry groups to try to infiltrate this settlement.
The situation remains extremely difficult in the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad direction, and this difficulty is caused not only by the infiltration of Russian troops into Pokrovsk that you mentioned, but also in the area between Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad. I think the key problem for our defense forces operating in this section of the front is the issue of stable and uninterrupted logistics. After all, the enemy continues to try to tighten the pincers of operational semi-encirclement around Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad, and the width of that very Kalovina, through which the main logistics routes pass, is quite narrow. Plus, it is constantly under fire from Russian mortarmen and artillerymen. In other words, there are plenty of problems there. That's why Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi and an officer from his staff are constantly present there. Undoubtedly, I am confident that every effort is currently being made to stabilize the situation. Firstly, there are ongoing combat clashes and clearing operations in the areas on the edges of this semi-encirclement. We're talking about the settlements of Krasny Lyman and Rudinsky. As far as I know, Rudinsky has been almost completely cleared of enemy presence. Additionally, fighting is taking place in the area of Kotlin, 1st of May, 1st Travnia. There's also some rather alarming information regarding the settlement of Rivne. It is located right between Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad. There, the enemy tried to break through our defensive lines. This attack was repelled, but the trend is absolutely clear. The enemy will continue, using their numerical advantage to try to penetrate deeper into our positions and attempt to cut off our supply routes. And here, as they say, the situation is hanging by a thread because it's obvious that this section of the front is a priority for the enemy. The enemy does not care about the huge number of losses on this section of the front, but for us it is extremely important to ensure stability in our defense. There is good news. Yesterday and the day before, Russian Z channels were spreading information about the alleged surrender of 25 Ukrainian Marines. Thank God that information turned out to be fake. And our Marines, just like other components of the Ukrainian Defense Forces, continue to bravely hold defensive positions on the designated section of the front. I am confident that, even under the current circumstances, despite the situation being extremely difficult, we should not lose hope. Given that we are making tremendous efforts to ensure that the situation remains within the trends and within our capabilities in terms of controlling the territories and positions we hold.
Vladislav, we have repeatedly discussed the fact that the enemy has concentrated a colossal amount of resources, at least in terms of manpower, around Pokrovsk. But we understand that one way or another, the situation is quite difficult in various sectors of the front. There are no areas where things are completely calm. Obviously, the number of offensive operations by the Russians fluctuates, but still. I would like to ask you, what is the current situation in the Kharkiv region around Kupiansk and accordingly there and in Vovchansk?
Yuri, with your permission, I'll start with Vovchansk. In fact, this direction has somehow been forgotten in the media. But actually, there are still quite intense clashes happening there. The enemy is still trying to cross the Vovcha River, trying to put pressure on our flanks in the area of Vovchansk's defenses, and unfortunately, the decisive destruction of the dam near the Belgorod reservoir by our drone operators did not have a significant impact on this situation. Russia still has a short logistic supply line and is able to replenish its assault units with enough personnel. In addition, enemy aviation and artillery are active, which also causes us trouble in this sector of the front. As for the Kupiansk direction, at present our defense forces are systematically and methodically clearing those areas where the enemy had infiltrated over a fairly long period of time. Regarding Kupiansk, I have a strong hope that we will be able to fully stabilize the situation in this sector of the front, not necessarily tomorrow, but in the near future. And in general, notice that the enemy is sending fewer and fewer assault groups to the Kupiansk area, but what are they trying to do instead? They are trying to expand the territory under their control north of Kupiansk, attempting to unite several invasion bridgeheads in the border area, the northeastern border of Kharkiv region, in order to expand that very buffer or sanitary zone. De facto, the Russian army is thus trying to carry out Putin's objective from May of last year. We all remember the task set by the Crimean dictator. Supposedly, the Russian army was to create a 10 to 15 kilometer buffer zone along the Ukrainian border. The idea was that this would ensure the security of their border territories. Obviously, this objective has completely failed. The fighting in the Vovchansk area The fighting in the Sumy direction essentially confirms this thesis, because it's clear that in order for the enemy to implement the plan of creating a buffer zone, they would need significant forces and resources. But at present, these forces are concentrated against opponents in other sectors of the front, whether it's the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad direction or in the east and south. In the Zaporizhzhia region, because that's exactly where the main fighting has been developing recently.
Vladislav, you see, you led us right to this point, because the Freedom Telegram channel is reporting that the President of Ukraine visited the command post of the 65th Separate Mechanized Brigade Veliki Luk Vidyamuli, thanked the soldiers for their service and presented them with awards. As noted, the brigade is holding the defense in the Kharkiv direction as part of the 17th Corps. Zelensky listened to a report on the situation and enemy activity, as well as on the losses suffered by the occupiers. Naturally, they also discussed measures to strengthen the defense. They talked about staffing, weapons supplies, equipment, including lightly armored vehicles equipped with electronic warfare systems. Vladislav, regarding the situation in the Zaporizhzhia region, I would like to ask for your assessment of what we are observing in the Huliaipol area, since we are indeed seeing that the enemy is also trying to become more active and advanced there.
By the way, I'd like to take this opportunity to encourage our audience to subscribe to the Freedom Telegram channel. All the necessary information is gathered there. If you need a summary of the events happening both in Ukraine and around the world right now, I recommend the Freedom Telegram channel. I'm subscribed myself and I invite you to do the same. As for the situation in the south of the Zaporizhzhia region, I think it's no coincidence that the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky, is present on this section of the front today. The situation there is tending to escalate, and this escalation is due to the fact that the enemy is partially shifting its efforts to the south of the Zaporizhzhia region. In fact, on Freedom, we have repeatedly discussed that it was only a matter of time before the enemy would set in motion the forces and resources concentrated in the south of the Zaporizhzhia region. Basically, we are now witnessing these processes. The fighting taking place in the eastern areas of the Zaporizhzhia region, coming from the direction of Huliaipol, is highly symptomatic. The enemy is still trying to achieve by force of arms the objective that has been included in the new edition of the Russian Constitution. I mean the complete occupation of all the territories that have been added to this Russian constitution, including the Zaporizhzhia region. The dynamics on the battlefield are determined not only by the fighting in the direction of Huliaipol, but also in the direction of Kharkiv and in the areas of Stepnohirsk and Plavny. There too, the enemy has been attacking our lines and positions for quite some time already. This dynamic is due to the fact that the enemy has a rather powerful set of forces and resources here, and these forces and resources are not only several times greater than our grouping deployed in this sector of the front, but in general they also have quite substantial firepower and air support. Therefore, I believe that in the coming weeks and months, the enemy will focus more and more of their efforts precisely on this sector of the front. And, in principle, the attention from the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, to this sector of the front is due to the very trends that are happening here and now. But in any case, I believe that over a long period of time, the Ukrainian army has managed to create a rather powerful system of engineering fortifications in this direction. And this means that the enemy will try to attack, but it's unlikely if we're talking about the success of enemy actions. Although the logic of the Russians is obvious. They are trying to get as close as possible to the regional center of Zaporizhzhia so they can use tube artillery to literally break down this residential area to its very molecules. This is a tactic the enemy has been using since the events of the war, the Russian and Chechen War of the 1990s, and it works here in the same way. That is, before capturing a particular settlement, the enemy tries to literally destroy it down to the foundation. Basically, in this regard, the enemy's actions in the Zaporizhzhia direction are not any kind of innovation.
Vladislav, and finally, I'd just like you to comment on why, because, it's important for people to have some perspective. I understand that in this story, yes, in the war of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, making predictions might be a thankless task, but still. This statement was made by the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. We mentioned in the news that, according to her, Europe will continue to be a reliable partner for Ukraine in terms of the resources provided by the European Union to our country. And she noted that the EU will continue to stand by our country in countering this Russian aggression. Accordingly, she noted, and I will quote, Vladislav, this winter will determine the future of the war in Ukraine, and our response must be up to the task. She was speaking about how the European Union will act. But should we really look at this winter in that way, Vladislav? Maybe something will become clear. But we can also add the forecasts of economists, which, as you know, are not getting any better for the Russian Federation. Yes, everyone is saying that the end of this year and the next will be truly radically different for the Russian Federation and for the ability of the Russian economy to keep going in the future.
Yes, Yuri, your shot is right on target because it's obvious that the Russian Federation is gradually entering a state of stagnation. Its economy just can't keep up, no matter what the top Russian officials and chief propagandists say. The sanctions pressure, is taking its toll. In addition to this sanctions pressure from Europe and the United States of America, the so-called sanctions named after General Vasil Malyuk are being added. They are no less effective and quite painful, both for the Russian economy and its replenishment. It is clear that such activities, at least in terms of the sanctions named after General Malyuk, will continue in the future. And this means that the Russian Federation will receive fewer and fewer corresponding dividends, the lion's share of which goes to finance the so-called special military operation. Yes, the winter will be difficult, that's for sure, but I think that by spring we will definitely see very clear signs of stagnation in the Russian economy. And let Russians, those who were filled with hope that during the winter campaign they would be able to radically change the situation on the battlefield, remember the rather ambitious plans the Russian army had for the summer phase of this year's offensive campaign. How did it all end? With very, very modest gains. The only area where the Russians have shown themselves and demonstrated significant growth is in increasing the tally of their losses, killed and wounded Russian servicemen. No one in the world is surprised by this anymore. And in fact, this tally increases daily by at least 1,000 killed and wounded Russian soldiers. That's why it's clear that the winter will be tough, but I'm betting on our side, because it's obvious that the resilience of our defense is determined not only by the courage and heroism of our soldiers. It is also defined by resilience, bravery, and a readiness for rather unconventional solutions. Of the Ukrainian top military and political leadership, the Ukrainian people, as well as the support of our European and overseas partners. Well, as the saying goes, together even a father can be beaten. That's why I'm confident that by joining our efforts, we can stand up to an enemy who surpasses us many times over, both in material and technical resources and in manpower capacity.